Welcome to Under the Radar, a show about independent iOS app development. I'm Marco Arment.
And I'm David Smith. Under the Radar is never longer than 30 minutes, so let's get started. So today, I think we wanted to talk through is a little bit of follow-up on the pricing discussion we had a few episodes ago, and B, talk about the actual app that we were talking in vague terms about then, and that I recently launched. And given that even for someone like me, launching an app is a fairly rare thing in the scheme of what we do, and so having just done it, I wanted to kind of talk through what that process is like, both sort of functionally as well as emotionally, and kind of just go from there. So first, the app that I launched, is probably worth saying, is called Activity++. If you have any familiar with any of my work, you're probably familiar with an app called Pedometer++ or Sleep++, or Emoji++. I've kind of got into this thing where plus is sort of like the name. It's actually really helpful from a naming perspective, because I just take whatever like proper noun or verb that describes the thing that I'm doing, add a plus, and that kind of works as a sort of like a trademark thing that people recognize.
Which is great because it helps you avoid actual trademark conflicts, because like activity is not a trademarkable word in that
Exactly.
area. Like you're not going to have a conflict with that. Although it doesn't do you any favors with App Store search.
No, it does not. But that is as best I can tell, it like half helps, because the plus, as far as I can tell, is ignored for the purposes of search. At least as best I can tell. And so when people search, I do very well for generic searches, but I do not do well for exact searches, which, it's good and bad, but, it's when the plus naming kind of came by accident more than intentionally. And so it just sort of was one of these things of like, well, now that it exists, and whether or not it's great or not in the App Store search, it just sort of is its own thing, and would be worse to change than to stick with. So that's just sort of where I am. I like it. Yeah, but and I think it works well. It rolls off the tongue. Everyone kind of knows how it works, and I like it, and I like that it's geeky too. But anyway, so Activity++ is something that takes advantage of some new APIs that were added in 9.3 and watchOS 2.2, where we can finally get access to all the data in the Activity app. So if you have Apple Watch, you'd be familiar with like the three rings. There's like the red ring, which is your active calories, the green ring, which is your amount of exercise, and the blue ring, which is the amount you've stood or hours you've stood in a day. And we finally have access to that as a third party. And so what I did is I just said, I use the Activity app a lot. I like that sort of concept of sort of measuring how I'm doing in terms of activity and fitness. But I don't really like Apple's Activity app, especially on the phone. I find it really awkward. Like it's trying to do so much, and because of that, it does the basics kind of awkwardly. So, as soon as I saw that I could do this, whenever they announced 9.3, which I think was a couple months ago, I dived into it. It's like, this is something that I wanted to do. And so I did. I made an app that is an alternative to that. This is an area that I think, if you're a developer looking to find like a new market to get into, this is always something that I've found some success with, of looking through the API diffs every time Apple releases something and saying, you know what, this is something new, something like this type of app is entirely not possible before, and then suddenly is possible. So you're necessarily going to be competing in a smaller market, which is something I'll mention a bit later, but is always a helpful thing to kind of dive into that, because the reality is there's three types of apps that are probably sort of worth making. There's something like this, where it's sort of new and novel because it couldn't have been done before, for policy reasons or technical reasons. Like this data just wasn't available to third-party apps before. And you can go ahead and do that. Or there's like the apps that are just like sort of truly novel, like someone just sort of invents something totally new, which are typically very hard to do or think up. Or the third is the type of app that are it's the same thing, just done slightly better or different. And the last two, like if you can do for the second one, where you have like true innovation, like you just invent something amazing that could have been done before, but now you're doing it in a better way, more power to you. That's awesome. That's pretty rare and, kind of hard to just do on a regular basis. So most people end up doing the apps that are just like the same thing that's been, exists before, but done better. But those are really competitive because by nature of being something you could have done before, people already have. And so whenever you have an opportunity to do the first thing, to be able to just do something that wasn't possible before just because of technical reasons or policy reasons, it's a great opportunity. And so, sort of that's what I did. And I've now launched it. I think I launched it last Thursday. And, the launch has been going well. It's been been very, very well received, which is always really, affirming with something like this. Because you put it out into the world and you never really know what's going to happen. But in a bit of a twist, it is a paid upfront app. And in fact, it is a $3 paid upfront app, which if you were listening to our discussion 2 or 3 episodes ago where I talked about pricing, paid upfront was the form of business model that I had sort of in our final conclusions had kind of thrown out as not possible. And so that's a bit of a surprise. But I wanted to kind of talk through why I did that, because I think it's helpful as a thought process to sort of show that what we're doing as independent developers and developers in general, but especially as independent developers, is we have to be making these decisions that ultimately, like, there's no right answer for. You can never know like which business model is going to be best. There's a lot, you can never know which design decision is going to be best. Like when you're designing your icon or designing your layout, like there's all these things that you just have to make a decision and you have to just sort of live with it. But you kind of, and you have to work out what process makes the most sense for you. So in this case, I looked at for pricing, and as we finished in our last discussion, like I was probably leaning towards something like free with ads or something like that. And the more that I thought about that, like the next week, I listened to the episode a couple times, and I was just kind of mulling it over, and I kept being like, you know what? Like, I don't like how this feels. I don't like that more and more of my business is becoming reliant on ads, especially in the time of kind of a little bit of, turmoil is the wrong word, but there's a little bit of upheaval in terms of exactly what the right advertising platform is, what that's going to look like come when iAd ends this June. And it seemed like a really poor time to be doubling down on that model. And so I said, you know what? I'd rather have diversity in terms of I'd rather have a paid app, even if it didn't perform theoretically as well as a free app, just to have some diversity, to have some backup in terms of if one of my free with ad apps starts to really plummet in terms of revenue, I have something to back up. And the biggest thing that was holding me back was the thought that, oh man, this is a watch app though. And so if you don't have a watch, people are going to be annoyed. But I saw in the app store, there was an app called HeartWatch, which is by a gentleman named David Walsh, who is a similar kind of thing, but it's focused all on the heart rate data that the Apple Watch collects. And it's a great app, and I'd recommend you taking a look at it if that's something you're interested in. But I was kind of curious if he was having this trouble, because he had a paid app. And it didn't seem like in his App Store reviews and in general that he was having trouble with people complaining that, oh, I bought your app and I don't have a watch, boo-hoo. And so I was like, okay, maybe that's not a problem. And then I did what I always do when I'm trying to deal with these types of problems, is I went to a spreadsheet. Because for me, I can't make decisions like this without a spreadsheet usually, because I need to have something that I can kind of point to rationally and say, is this viable? Is this going to work? Am I being foolish? And in just looking at myself, it's often easy to kind of confuse or betray myself by kind of what I want or what I think would be nice. But numbers, if you're doing it right, typically can't do that. And so I took a look at how much money I make per user right now in Pedometer++, which is my single biggest app, which is like in my mind the best case scenario for a new app it would match that. And right now, and I do it on the basis of new users, not of active users or existing users, because that gets really complicated. So I tend to look at it as like based on the number of downloads I get, how much revenue do I get each day? And for Pedometer right now, it's like 20 cents a user or something like that, which I think for a free app is actually not too bad. And so then the nice thing when you think about that, though, is like if you sell an app for $3, you end up with $2.10 back from Apple for each user. And so as long as you can maintain a tenth of the downloads that you get otherwise, you'll kind of break even. And I looked at that and I was like, 10x, that seems doable. That seems possible. Like the number of downloads per day that Activity++ would have to maintain that isn't completely inconceivable. And so I went for it. And the nice thing about free, or sort of starting paid rather than free, is that I can always switch and go free later if I want. I can use the App Store receipt system to know if someone paid for it up front or not. And if they did, then great. I'll just sort of hide the ads or hide the in-app purchases or whatever it is. But I can always make that change down the road. And so that's what I did. And it, seems to be working. I feel good about it, which is probably the best thing. That in the end, I like that, it's a more, it feels a bit more premium. It feels a bit nicer of an app to not have any ads in it, to not have to think about that kind of stuff, and to just put it out as, something that's good.
Yeah, it's also, just, as we discussed in the pricing episode, a paid upfront model is just so much simpler on you, on the developer, for both designing the app around it and also just having to code all the in-app purchase stuff or embed other people's crazy, kind of creepy ad frameworks. Paid upfront is just so much easier and simpler, and it really does just simplify the model. What's the relationship between you and your customers? What's being done with their data, if anything? How do you survive? How do you make money? Like, it's all right up front there, and there are downsides to it, of course, but I think if you can make the numbers work out, paid upfront is of course the easiest way to do it, and overall by easy I mean simple. It's the simplest way to do it, and there's a lot of benefits to that.
Yeah, exactly. And like I said, I'm happy with it right now, and I think the reality is with pricing is there is no there's no good answer. There's no right answer. Because the reality is, if as developers we determine this is the perfect thing to do, if you do this, this, and this, you'll maximize revenue fully. Sort of almost like the stock market. As soon as that becomes known and everyone does it, it'll almost inevitably become the wrong thing.
Right.
By the nature of everybody doing it, it saturates that type of thing and then it becomes problematic. And so ultimately, you just have to go with your gut and decide what you're going to feel comfortable with. And in this situation, I was like, you know what? I like this app. I really felt proud of it. And I was like, I don't want to put ads in it. I don't want to, I like the way it looks. I want it to look that way. And, so this is the road I went down. And I think, the market was better than I was fearing it might be. It's definitely still in the very steep drop off phase where your first couple days are like, yay, this is awesome, and then it starts to go down. And every day, I log into iTunes Connect and I'm like, is this the bottom? Is this the bottom? What about this? Is this the new bottom? And I don't think we've quite reached there yet, which is always a bit scary. Is it going to go all the way to zero? Where's this going to go? But so far so good. And I think there's still something to be said for paid upfront apps. And the funny thing is, I didn't have anyone that I was aware of complain about the price at $3 at $3, which also surprised me slightly that it wasn't $3. I guess once you're paid, you're paid, and the difference between $1 and $3 is much more intellectually minor compared to free and $1. So that worked out kind of well.
I think maybe one of the reasons you're able to do it for this app is, as you said at the beginning of the show, the kind of different apps that you have, different types of apps that are possible to make. In this case, this is a very non-crowded category. So it is, in many ways, it behaves a lot more like the early App Store, back when the entire App Store wasn't very crowded, which was actually very short-lived. But, that was maybe a couple of weeks. But at that time, you could sell something for $5, $10, and it didn't even have to be that good, and people would buy it because they wanted that kind of thing, and there just were no other alternatives, or there were very few other alternatives. And in this case, when you do what you gave as the first type of app you could make, which is the kind of app that just recently became possible by some kind of API or technical change, you effectively create, or you enter a market where there is almost no competition up front. And it is kind of like those first few weeks of the App Store where you can charge a price up front. And if people want that kind of app, they'll be more willing to pay for it because there aren't 50 free alternatives that do the exact same thing right below it in the App Store search.
Exactly. And, and it's a nice thing to take advantage of. So the launch has been going well. Something else I wanted to talk through a little bit about the launch, because I get this question a lot from people who are launching their first app, and it's how do you get attention for a new product? And some of it is just you just kind of have to keep trying, which is not a very satisfying answer. But I was very grateful I had a few news and press sites write up the app, which is always really kind of exciting and awesome to see, something you made on a site that you respect deeply. And so the way in which that I would the biggest like recommendation I can make with that is to make sure what you're doing when you're reaching out to them, and like you should be reaching out to the press ahead of time, like especially the sites that you read yourself. Like it sounds a lot better if it doesn't come, if it's not like a cold call, insofar as like you read the site, you know the kind of things they do, you know what excites them. You know, like some sites are really interested in the visual design or the typography or those types of things. Other sites tend to be more feature focused. And so when you're writing your emails, like write a different email to each of those people, letting them know, take advantage of the test flight system, which is something that I did, this time around, where it's nice to be able to send out copies of your application to the press. I personally take the approach of always asking if they want access to it. Like I'll send them an email first. Whenever I've had a couple people do this to me, where like you just sort of like blindly get a test flight invite for an app that I've never heard of.
Yeah, it's no good.
That's not really what you want. Like you want to have the personal reach out first and say, hey, this is something I'm working on. Maybe include a few screenshots or a video or something like that. Send that out to somebody, and at the end, just say, hey, if you want to check this out, I'd be happy to send you a test flight. And if you're doing it right, and if you're sort of targeting your message to them appropriately, that you look at what other articles they've read, and you said, hey, I saw that you wrote, this article about another fitness tracker or something, or that seems to be something that you're, that's relevant to you, and like actually, if you are correct in that, like go to a website, see who's the one who writes about the products that are typically, that would be appropriate, and you send that over. And more often than not, they'll say, sure, send me a test flight, because obviously. But it's much better coming from that respect than just like a blind thing. So that was just something I wanted to mention. But yeah, then otherwise you just kind of keep at it. It certainly is easier, I will say, having done this for so long and having some amount of reputation and platform. It is doubtless easier than that. In that regard, and in the way it's like, oh, it's like that's nice for Underscore to be able to reach out to people and know it, but. The reality is everyone starts off this way. Like, no, I did not, the first time I wrote, had an app written up by a publication, it was a big deal for me because I'd tried many times before and gotten nothing. So you just kind of have to keep trying and hope that in the end it'll happen, and, be respectful of people. And if, you write an email to somebody and they don't write back, it's not the kind of thing that's like, oh, I wonder if they didn't get it. Let me bring this to the top of their inbox. Let me respond 3 times. Like, just be respectful and understand that they may have not responded because they just don't have time, or they're not interested, and they're trying to, it's kind of it's easier to be kind by just not saying anything sometimes than it is to, try and respond back in the negative, and just sort of hope for the best.
Our sponsor this week is Pingdom. Go to pingdom.com. Pingdom is a great monitoring service for websites. If you go to pingdom.com, you can get a free 14-day trial. And when you enter offer code RADAR at checkout, you get 20% off your first invoice. Now, I personally have been a Pingdom customer for, I think, almost 10 years now. We used it in the early days of Tumblr, and I use it for all my own projects since then. And we used it, I think, the entire time I was at Tumblr, actually. So they might still use it. And it is just so good for monitoring websites for uptime, for error conditions, or even for changes. So there's so many ways you can use Pingdom. I mean, first of all, if you have a website or a web service that you run, anything that can be checked over HTTP or HTTPS, basically, you can have Pingdom test that for you, and they can test it once a minute or less frequently than that if you want. They can test it from 70 different global test servers around the world, so that you can see if you're like down in some region of the world for some reason, maybe some crazy routing issue. You can see that, and Pingdom. I know just from having used it that my stuff breaks in minor ways all the time. I might have a server with low RAM, or a disk is running low, or there's some kind of weird connectivity issue where like half the servers just disappear for a minute, and that was a problem with the host maybe, or with a routing issue somewhere. So Pingdom has helped me find all these things over literally almost a decade. I think I started using them in roughly 2006, 2007, so it really has been almost a decade. And they are just the best at this stuff. We've even used Pingdom, you and I, David, have both used Pingdom to do things like monitor the WWDC page for changes. Yeah. Back when it was like a first come, first served ticket system, where we would have it set up so that like if the WWDC page changes, it would alert us, as if one of our websites was down. So you can do SMS alerts, you can do push notifications, you can do emails, and so it's great for that. It's great for monitoring your own stuff. All you need to give them is a URL to hit, and you can have them either check to see if it gives a response or if it gives a certain substring or doesn't give a certain substring as a response. You can do SSL, you can do cookies. There's so much stuff you can do with Pingdom. I definitely recommend it personally, and I don't do that a lot. I personally recommend Pingdom for anything you have to monitor, either for uptime or for changes or for performance. So check it out today. Go to pingdom.com for a 14-day free trial and take 20% off when you enter the offer code RADAR at checkout. Thank you very much to Pingdom for sponsoring our show.
All right. And the last thing I wanted to kind of talk through about a launch is kind of the actual dynamics of it, like the actual timing and sort of logistics of doing it. Because it's kind of a tricky process, because when you are trying to launch an app, you don't really know when that's going to be. Sometimes, I think I submitted this application as soon as it was physically possible to submit 9.3 binaries. And from that point on, like, my goal is to be ready to launch it whenever Apple is available, because, like we've been saying this episode so many times, there's a certain element of like first mover advantage with something like this. Like, you want, if you're building something that's newly possible, being one of the, being the first or second application that takes advantage of that API is going to be much more useful to you than if you're just like one of 10. And so I wanted to be, I sat there in iTunes Connect trying to hit submit and having it come back and say, like, we're not ready for this binary version yet. We're not ready for this binary version. Like, essentially every 10 minutes until I think it was about 10 p.m. that night when it finally went through. And it's like, I wanted to be that confident that I was like the first of the 9.3 apps in line.
That's dedication.
Well, this is the thing though. Like, I've spent months working on this. And so spending an afternoon sitting there hitting next, it's like try, gives me any advantage. I'd feel foolish if in the end that, like not doing that would have come back to bite me. In this case, it ended up taking a bit longer than usual for app review, which can be a bit, always a bit worrisome. We talked about that a little bit in our last, or our second to last episode, I think, about app review. But it's just the reality. Sometimes you never really know. And so what I did though, and this is like the thing that I always try and make sure that I've done, is have anything that you're going to be doing about the launch. Like, I tend to have like a blog post, that I launch along with the app, and certainly keeping people in the press aware of the situation, but have everything ready to go so that, like, whenever Apple said, "Hey, you're approved," I could go ahead and launch it. So I had my blog post written, I had the screenshots all done for that, like everything was ready and waiting, which is much better than after you finally get your approval email, which is yay, that's exciting, and then you're like, oh goodness, now what do I now I need to do all this work, but like you had weeks or days when you had nothing else to do for this application that you could have been doing it. So definitely something that I recommend doing. Kind of comically this time, emphasizing how little control you have over the timing. I ended up launching this app while I was on vacation with my family. Like, I actually hit release this version while I was sitting in a children's museum in Phoenix, which was kind of just like a strange place to be sitting on a bench and like, what I need to get this out. But it worked. The iTunes Connect app that Apple puts out is very useful and can do all these types of things. And one thing I will say, and this is a recommendation if you are certainly new to this, is launching an app that doesn't have any back end services related to it is incredibly relieving, because there was no servers for me to monitor. See our sponsor. Like, I didn't have any notifications or things that I need to worry about because the app is entirely local. And so that's always kind of a recommendation. If you're kind of timid about what this is going to be like, maybe start off with something that doesn't have a back end, or has as simple a back end as possible, because it is really reassuring that, like, there's nothing in this app there's no data that the user can lose. There's no back-end infrastructure I need to maintain. Like, it is just an app that you launch. If you give it permission to access your HealthKit data, it pulls it in and shows it to you. And like, that's all it does. And so that was really a nice thing, especially when I'm on vacation. Like, I launched it and kind of participated slightly in it, but then went back to my vacation and went to the Grand Canyon the next day and hiked around there with my family and didn't really pay much attention to it, which was odd but nice. But
That's
just
awesome.
keep that so you just kind of have to keep that in mind when you're launching these things, that you have no control over it. That ultimately, and being you just kind of like, I don't know, it's like a Zen thing, which is like accept that you have no control about the situation and just kind of roll with it as it goes. Because there were certainly times that I would get a bit frustrated, but ultimately, like, it worked out. It worked out fine. The app's in the store, it's live, and I just decided, it's this is the right time to launch it, because if this is when the first approvals of 9.3 apps are going to go out, like, I want to be in that wave if there was a wave. As far as I know, there hasn't been much of a wave, and so some of my fears were a bit unfounded, but you never know, because a lot of these things, you just end up kind of fearing the unknown when you're launching an app. Like, I've been doing this for 7.5 years, I think, and I still have like tremendous anxiety about launching something new. And I say that because hopefully that's helpful to listeners of the show who are launching things of themselves. When you look at it's like, if you're launching your first app, you're probably just as nervous as I still am about it, and that's okay. That's part of the process. Like, and you have these fears of like, what if this is actually not very good? What if I'm putting this out in the world and everyone's kind of going to laugh at me? Like, it becomes very like I'm like in high school or middle school or something, like this kind of that feeling of being nervous about what other people think of you.
Oh, I'm the same way.
Yeah, and I think that's healthy to say, though. Like, it is difficult, and no matter what, you're going to feel that way. So just like embrace it and understand that it gets better, because if you've been building it right, if you've been making a thoughtful design that works well and is functional, and you've tested it and you've beta tested it with the right people who are hopefully would be honest with you if it really wasn't very good, and they say it's good, then just trust them and go for it. And maybe it'll be awesome, maybe it'll be mediocre, but it doesn't do any good to fret too much about it as much as you can. And then it's out in the world, and now it's like the funny thing. I always try and celebrate launches. It's like, we were on vacation, but we did our best to kind of celebrate that it was out in the world. Especially, I try and bring my kids into that because they have kind of a vague sense of what Daddy does, and so it's kind of fun when I can show them like, hey, here's this thing I just launched in the App Store, and I can like show it to them in the App Store. And then the funny thing about launching is it feels like this big deal, and then it's done, and then you just move on. And now you get a big long list of bugs, the things you have to fix, and you just keep going on that. And so it's like you want to celebrate it. And now it's like, all right, now it's on to 1.1 or 1.01, or you identify all the issues that you just never even thought could be issues, which is always the most striking thing to launch an app for myself, where you have somebody who gives you feedback, and you're like, huh, you are absolutely right, but I had never ever thought about that. And like, that's always the best and most fun feedback to get.
That's why my Overcast beta was 6 months long.
There you go. And it was I was on it from the first one to the last one, and I would say it got a lot better.
It did. It really did. Everything I hadn't thought of, everyone brought up. All right. I think that does it for this week. So congratulations on the launch. Any closing thoughts?
No, I think the only thing I'd say is, launch something. It's exciting. Like, I get a lot of questions from people like, how do I get started? And it's like, the best way to get started is to write something and ship it. Like, there's not like magic rocket science to this, and you just have to do that. And the more you do that, the better you get at doing it, and the better your apps will be as a result. And, I've launched a lot of products, as I have a bit of a penchant for doing. And, I imagine in June, we'll get a bunch of new APIs and new opportunities. And so I'd encourage everyone to look at them, just don't look at the same ones that I'm looking at. We're going to have a problem. We're going to have a problem.
All right. Thanks, David. Everybody, please go out and buy Activity++, because David won't say it, but I will. And we will talk to you next week.
Thanks. Bye.